All right, great. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Farm Bill Policy and Advocacy Communication Series hosted by the Wallace Center. I'm Annalena Kazikas with the Wallace Center, and it's so great to see so many of you joining the call today. This series is a three-part series that will be delivered over the next several weeks to bring you the tools and skills for developing and deploying compelling messaging to create an equitable and sustainable 2023 Farm Bill. A huge thank you to the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition for supporting this super important work. So for the last 40 years, the Wallace Center has been an advocate of developing local and regional food and farming systems. We bring together a diversity of people and ideas to co-create solutions that build healthy farms, equitable economies, and resilient food systems. We envision a world where all communities have the power to nourish themselves and regenerate ecosystems through just food and agriculture systems. The Wallace Center hosts two networks to help drive this work forward, which you all may be familiar with: the Food Systems Leadership Network and the Regenerative Agriculture Idea Network. The FSLN is a national peer learning community that connects current and emerging leaders, strengthens individual and collective leadership capacity, and fosters collaboration across communities to accelerate the realization of a just, equitable, and sustainable food system. Regain leverages the knowledge of regenerative ag educators, advocates, and leading practitioners to increase regenerative practices, support profitable family farms, protect vulnerable ecosystems, and increase the resilience of agricultural communities. Both networks offer resource libraries, technical assistance support, and networking opportunities. So if you're not already connected in with either one of these networks, we will be sure to send you more information on how to join and how to get involved in follow-up emails. So as stewards of food systems networks, we know just how important this year is. The Farm Bill is coming up to vote this fall, and it's a critical piece of legislation that has a direct impact on nutrition, hunger, the economy, community development, farmers, food activists, and so much more. We believe that if we're to create a transformative 2023 Farm Bill, those directly impacted by the legislation, all of us here today, must really be at the forefront of Farm Bill advocacy campaigns. We need to be engaging with our legislators, our fellow constituents, and creating and disseminating compelling messaging to help make the case for local and regional food and farming systems. So here we are. This is session one of a three-part series, and today we're going to be introduced to a tool for identifying your audiences and crafting and compelling messaging based on their needs. Session two will be next week and will feature messaging campaigns and case studies from several food systems organizations. And then session three, which will be later in March, will be a workshopping session with Spitfire strategies to help us think through how we might put into practice all that we've been learning. So thank you all again for joining us today. We know that some of you are steeped in policy communications and others are just getting into this work. This space and the two networks that the Wallace Center facilitates are great places to learn from each other and to tap into the expertise of everyone on the call. Please use the chat box to ask your questions, to share your own experiences, your own expertise, your own advice, and really get the juices flowing. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Melanie Moon with Spitfire Strategies, a fantastic equity-driven communications firm who's going to lead us through the session today. So Melanie, go for it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Annalena. Welcome, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. As Annalena said, my name is Melanie. I am a vice president at Spitfire Strategies, which is a strategic communications firm that works primarily with foundations and nonprofits focused on making the world a better place. We believe that strategic communications can actually help make real social change. So I am so excited to be here with all of you today. I've been working with Annalena and the Wallace Center and some partners at the FSLN over the past year. So it is wonderful to learn from you all and hear about your work. So today, we're going to be talking about policymaker engagement and messaging. So we're going to dive into all things related to audiences, specifically local, state, and federal policymakers that you would like to engage on the Farm Bill. We're going to talk about strategies for how to identify them and how to actually engage them in indirect and direct ways. We'll talk through how to craft and deliver messages that really resonate. We'll also go over some tips and tricks for developing this messaging based in social science. And then we'll close out by talking about how we can create a really good ask, a call to action that brings our audiences into the work that we care about so much. And then Annalena will close us out with some next steps and reminders for our upcoming sessions. As she mentioned, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'd also love for you all to put your name, your organization, where you're located, so we can all get to know each other a little bit better over the next hour. And we'll have time for questions throughout today's presentation and of course at the end. All right. So let's get started by thinking about strategies. How can we actually identify and engage those that we want to engage with? How can you effectively reach who you need to reach to achieve your goals and priorities, specifically on the Farm Bill, which we'll be discussing at length today? So before today's session, we asked all of you to respond to a really simple survey talking about your organization's priorities for the Farm Bill. We heard a multitude of things. We heard a need to strengthen access across key programs like SNAP. We heard about a need to increase effectiveness of the bill overall, an increase of funding for different projects, and also a need for land access for BIPOC farmers and ranchers, among many others. You all are on the front lines of this work, and all of these priorities are so important to move the Farm Bill forward. So as we think about ways to really engage and set a strategy for meeting with our policymakers, we want to think about these priorities at a high level. What are we actually trying to achieve in the next 6, 12, 24 months? How can we make these priorities smart? How can we make them smart objectives that ultimately will need communications to succeed? All of our objectives should be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So thinking about your work, whether it's to increase funding for a specific program on the Farm Bill, focusing on climate action, increasing infrastructure dollars for the bill, what are you trying to achieve and how can you make it as smart as possible? All of these questions are going to help you really develop communication strategies to reach your target audiences. So taking a step back here, we all have one common overarching goal. We want to create a transformative Farm Bill in 2023. But to do this, we all have different things that we want to achieve. So whether that's changing state, local, or federal policies, whether that's changing behaviors of constituents, of farmers, or maybe it's a fundraising priority that we have. We want to increase funding for a specific program or a piece of the bill. All of these priorities are different, but they all require communications to achieve. So all of you today have one of these objectives that's specific to the Farm Bill. So taking that objective, think about these core questions. Prior to engaging or identifying your policymaker, we want to ask ourselves, who holds the power to actually get this thing done that I want to get done on the Farm Bill? Is it a policymaker? Is it actually a legislative aide that you need to reach prior to connecting with the policymaker directly? Is it an activist group? Somebody on the front lines of advocacy? And then once you have an idea of who holds that power, you want to ask yourself, how do I actually reach them? So I have my objective in mind. I know who holds the power to make that change happen. How can I get in contact with them? Maybe you already have an existing relationship. Maybe you have a relationship that you want to build that you haven't taken care of in a while. Maybe you have to go through constituents first in order to connect with that staff member or that staff office. Or maybe there's other messengers that you want to engage in the field. And then you want to ask yourself, what do these policymakers, these staffers, these activist groups, what do they need from you? All of these questions are so important to ask yourself to set that strategy forward. So what does a policymaker really need from you to understand your objective, what you want to get done on the Farm Bill? They want a clear solution. They want evidence. They want stories. They want statistics. And they also want to know that whatever you're proposing is going to help them gain public support, specifically support with their constituents. But remember that all of the answers to these questions are going to look different for all of you based off of your priority for the Farm Bill. But all these questions are key to setting up your strategy. Because once you have these questions answered, you have one, set your objective, two, identified and gotten to know your audience a bit, and three, you have this plan for engagement. You know what you need to do and how you're going to achieve it. So once we have our strategy in place on what we want to get done in the Farm Bill, who we need to reach, we also want to think about and be cognizant of the landscape around us. So who's in power? Consider the dynamics, whether that's at the local, state, or federal level. Who holds power? Specifically, the party that's in power right now. Target them strategically, knowing the roles and responsibilities that they may play on different committees that are related to or directly related to the Farm Bill. Think about if you're reaching out to policymakers that may have been there for a while. Are they veterans? Senior policymakers have a narrow public policy focus. They have an issue area that they are feeling comfortable with that you can engage them on. New policymakers, those who are recently elected, they're junior, they're wannabe experts. They want to build that reputation. So thinking about this landscape, these dynamics at play, who do you want to engage and why? But remember that today, this is just a real brief overview of power dynamics. We're not going to go into specifics about committee assignments or specific dynamics regarding party leadership. But if you're an expert, put it in the chat. If there are things that you've learned over time when it comes to the Farm Bill, engaging with policymakers across the federal government or local government, put it in the chat. We'd love to hear it. But all of these things are so important for us to think about. And when considering the power dynamics, remembering that relationships matter. Policymaking is driven by relationships. Who do you have connections to? Research those local and state term limits. Perhaps those that you've had previous relationships with in the past are coming up on their term limits in the next election cycle. But engage your lawmakers to get attention of big administration officials. Build that momentum. And also think about ways that you could really educate and empower your policymaker with these relationships. So you're the conduit between connecting them to their constituents and also what they need from you on the Farm Bill. Don't wait to engage until you need something. Consider different opportunities to engage and reach with them throughout the year. So this could mean meeting with them or establishing some kind of grassroots connection. Grass tops leaders may be your way in. Think about ways that you can really build and strengthen these relationships. And then once you build these relationships, how do you leverage them? So if you have the opportunity to meet with your policymaker directly, we recommend 3 pieces of a good meeting. So your meeting should be divided up into 3 core parts. One is your introduction. So this is pretty simple, right? We want to establish the tone of the conversation. We want to be brief but personal. Establish why you're there and what you want to focus on. And then 2, tell your story. Make your issue personal. Keep it short, but tap into what your policymaker cares about. And we'll get into this a little bit as we go through the slides today. But tap into their values. What are they going to want to hear from you? And then finally, make your ask. What do you want the policymaker to do after they hear from you? And we'll talk through some examples of how to do this as well. And as we consider where you are in the room when meeting with your policymaker, whether this is in person or on Zoom, think about the purpose of this meeting. Own your place. Why is this meeting happening? What's your goal? Prepare for that interaction, but also be personal. You have a lived experience, either personally or through your organization, that you want to share and can share in order to really create this connection with the policymaker that resonates. Bring in stories and facts because we know that those overcome general dismissiveness and ignorance regarding issues that may be confusing or uncertain for folks. And also remember that policymaker meetings are polite and constructive. Most of the time, they go very smoothly. They're quite short, but there is an opportunity for you to make this experience the best possible experience for you and your issue. Any questions so far on strategies for identifying engaging policymakers and how to interact with them in indirect and direct ways? Anything in the chat, Annalena, we should bring up? All right. So let's shift from strategy to crafting and delivering messages. So you know who you want to reach, you know how you're going to reach them. What are you going to use to actually engage in a meaningful way? So we want to remember, first and foremost, what are we trying to achieve? What are our objectives? What's most important for us on the Farm Bill? And what do we want our policymaker or our key audience to do after we meet with them and deploy our messages? So we want to anticipate a couple of questions as we develop our messaging. They're going to ask you, what is the issue that you're really focused on? Of course, it's going to be the Farm Bill, but use value statements and identify things that they value to connect with them. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, but think about why are they going to ask you why it matters? Tailor your response to this policymaker. And then finally, they're going to ask what should be actually done about it. So have that clear call to action. Remember your objective. Do you want them to sign on to a bill? Do you want them to co-sponsor something? Do you want them to simply share information about your priority? Speak with committee members. Have that clear, even if it's a simplistic ask. And then after we anticipate these questions from the policymaker as we develop our messaging, let's think about what policymakers care most about. We divide these up into the 4 R's. One is reputation. We're seeing this a lot right now with Congressman Santos. He cares about reputation. He's going through a reputation management moment. All congressmen and women care about this. They want to retain power. They want a strong record that shows the work that they've done, and they want to show that they've had actual results within their community and for their constituents. Your messaging should tap into these values as much as possible. While your policymakers and your key audiences may care also about your specific issue, they may care about your priority on the Farm Bill. First and foremost, they're going to care about these 4 R's. So you're going to want to tap into all of these things as you build out your messaging. Okay. So as we think about tools for creating this messaging that we're going to deploy and engage with our policymakers and our key audiences, Spitfire has a tool called the message box. So this message box has 4 key components. All of these components actually are ways for you to tap into your values of your audience, overcome their barriers or challenges, pivot to the ask, and then loop in their value with the vision. And we're going to talk through all of these components and give an example. So first and foremost, when you're developing your messaging, you want to start your message with a value statement, a value message that connects your audience to their core concern. You want your audience to nod back in agreement with you. After tapping into their value, then you want to pivot to the overcome the barrier message. So this is the message that you want to overcome whatever challenge or barrier this audience has to agreeing with you or moving forward with the call to action. A lot of audiences will say a barrier is lack of knowledge about the issue, lack of relevancy, lack of time to dive in and understand. You're going to want to overcome that barrier without restating it. It's very important to not restate the barrier. If you restate the barrier, all your audience is going to remember is that barrier or challenge that they currently hold. And I'll give an example of this in just a minute, but it's very important to use this message to overcome the barrier and speak to what you can do to help this audience overcome a challenge. And then of course we have the ask. So after your value statement, you're overcoming the barrier message, then you have your ask, which is your call to action. What do you want this audience member to do? What do you want this policymaker to do after you've met with them, after they've read your materials? What's the next step? And then finally, the vision. So this is the vision message of what happens in the world if everything that you want to have happened actually occurs. So if your objective for the Farm Bill is achieved, what does the world look like? And how does that vision tap into their value as an audience member? What do they care most about? And why will they care about the vision of the world that you hold? Going through two examples here. The Innocence Project is an organization that Spitfire worked with a couple years ago, and the Innocence Project is an organization that works to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals from prison. A few years ago, the Innocence Project was working to pass a bill in Congress that provided DNA testing and ensured DNA testing for all those accused of a capital crime. But the bill was stuck in committee. So the Innocence Project came to us to look for messaging help to really engage with some of those policymakers and move the bill forward. So the audience for this message were senior members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Specifically, they were older, male, and Catholic. So this was the audience that they needed to create a message box for. The value message that they created was this: innocent people should not be wrongfully convicted and sentenced to die. This is the value statement that they had, that they told to these Senate Judiciary Committee members. And they nodded back in agreement because they also held a value of fairness, right? We believe in a fair system. Then they pivoted to the overcome the barrier message. So the barrier here for these committee members to passing or believing in the need for DNA testing is that they did not believe that innocent people were wrongfully convicted and sentenced to die in the United States. They said that's not the case. We don't have this issue here. Well, the Innocence Project overcame that barrier by saying actually more than 100 people have since 1976. So they were able to overcome that barrier with a very specific ask that we're getting into here, which is providing DNA testing to all accused of a capital crime. Very simple. And then vision. If we do this, if we pass this bill, then we'll have a more fair justice system, which taps back in to the committee members' value of fairness, right? Another message box example, this actually comes from the FSLN. We were working with them to build out some messaging, core messaging for tailored audiences late last year. And we created this message box where we were hoping to reach new and prospective funders for the network. These funders valued community-led solutions, but were not 100% sold on what a network approach would look like or the need for that to be successful. So this was our value message. Community-led, equity-centered solutions are vital for food systems change. So they tapped into the fact that they knew these prospective funders believed and valued community-led solutions that were also equity-centered, right? They overcame the barrier, which is a lack of understanding and knowledge about a network approach. So they said here, change is already happening. Through a network approach, FSLN accelerates solutions that foster real impact, right? Overcoming that barrier of uncertainty with certainty, without restating it. And then they pivot to their ask. So invest in the future of food systems change. Let's schedule a follow-up call. This is very specific, right? Even though it's a simple follow-up, it is very concrete. And then finally, their vision. With your support, leaders driving equity-centered solutions will have the power and resources they need to make their communities healthier. So looping in the vision with the value. With your support from our ask, we'll be able to do this thing that you care most about. Questions or thoughts on the message box, on values, barriers, core concerns, anything in the chat?
We did have some comments just talking around some strategies for sharing out the message box and, you know, having it kind of distilled down a little bit, but I think you might be getting to that.
Yep. So I'm about to talk through some opportunities to deploy the messaging and what that looks like. But in the follow-up workshop that we'll talk about at the end of today's session, we'll also go into what does this actually look like when you break down the messaging into this box structure? How do you then take that and create talking points? How do you take that and create social media posts or create a one-pager? The message box is really just a tool to ensure that your initial messaging is reaching your audiences in a tailored way. They're just the beginning of the messaging that you'll be creating regarding your Farm Bill priorities. Great. Okay. Some other tips here from social science research on creating and crafting messaging. So we want to avoid restating what doesn't work and what you don't want to have happen. This essentially is not repeating the barrier. So if you are aware of your audience's core concerns or challenges or barriers to action, we don't want to restate those. We want to overcome them. We also want to avoid jargon or acronyms to audiences that are unfamiliar with our work. So if you're talking to a policymaker who may be unfamiliar with your specific Farm Bill priority, making it as clear and simple as possible. And then we want to talk about how we can center equity. So if you are speaking to priorities that need to address systemic barriers, put that up front, right? We want to identify those systemic structural barriers when talking about equity-related issues. We want to center equity in our messaging. And also we want to be bold. Where can you be powerful? Where can you lend your personal and lived experience in these messages? And then we want to think about how we deploy them. So once we have our messages, we know which audiences we want to engage, and we have our strategy set, how can we actually send these messages to those that we want to engage with the most? So think back to those indirect and direct strategies that you may have for your policymakers. Maybe you're actually meeting with them in person. Maybe you're meeting with them virtually over Zoom. What materials are they going to need or they're going to want to see from you in order to understand your priorities? Policymakers love one-pagers. They love short brochures or about the organization packet, especially if they're uncertain of your work. Links, if it's a digital meeting, links to your website or newsletters that they can get up to date on where your issue stands. I've also worked with organizations that if they're looking for their policymaker to use their own messaging around a specific objective or issue, they'll give them a messaging toolkit with talking points and up-to-date news on what's going on. So thinking about ways that you could share out these types of materials using, of course, the message box. All right. Shifting to creating an ask that resonates. So taking a step back here, we've set our strategy, we know who we want to engage with, we have our tailored messages, but how can we actually give them a call to action that makes them move, that helps them understand where this work is moving forward? When including a call to action, we want to be cognizant of the fact that elevating an issue without identifying what people can do to resolve it may actually be harmful, because it can lead your audiences to believe that the issue is insurmountable. So give them hope. We see this also from social science, that hope and inspiration helps lead campaigns forward. What is actually doable and attainable, even if it's small, for this policymaker or audience member to complete or do after they meet with you? And plan for that ask. Keep it simple. Remember the 4 R's. Personalize it and localize it if possible, and ask for commitments and timelines. So if you're seeing that your policymaker, your audience is nodding back at you as you're engaging in your conversation, and they say something like, of course, we'll take a look at your proposal, or of course, we'll take a look at your one-pager. Follow it up. Glad to hear it. When should I expect to hear back from you? When would be a good time to follow up? Plan for that ask. We also want to think about, is this ask something that will help advance your priority or priorities for the Farm Bill? And can the policymaker actually do it? Is it attainable? Can it happen in 30 days or more? So thinking about, are you doing lobby-free asks or not? Are you looking for just letters of support or endorsement? Maybe it's just mentions or messages of your work in different communication channels. Introducing or having your policymaker introduce your work or your organization to another community leader or policymaker in the field. A bunch of different asks depending on your priority. And then we recommend laddering your ask. So considering the nature of your relationship with your audience, figure out whether this audience is on the bottom rung, the middle rung, or the top rung of your ladder of engagement. So maybe you're beginning your relationship with this audience or policymaker. So your relationship begins with that initial conversation where you're asking to schedule a meeting. It's not a heavy lift. The policymaker has only really agreed to be an observer. They just want to learn more, right? This is that conversation starter, starting at the bottom rung of this ladder of engagement. Once you have that meeting on the books, you've started to establish the relationship, you start to move up the ladder of engagement, moving into a supporter role, where you're asking your policymaker to do a little bit more than just meet with you and learn about the issue. You want them to perhaps share information about your Farm Bill priority. Maybe it's tweeting out or liking a post or co-writing a blog with you. Asking them to really support the work without a huge heavy lift. And then finally, after you've gotten their support on this level and ladder of engagement, how can you make them a champion? So ultimately, this is when you feel like your relationship is on super steady ground. You know that they have the information regarding your issue. They feel comfortable supporting it. Consider turning your policymaker or audience member into an issue spokesperson on behalf of whatever priority you're focused on for the Farm Bill. Are there events that they can speak or attend that you're hosting? Perhaps you're doing an AMA on Reddit that they could attend or be a co-host for. Maybe they could do a live Twitter session where they could provide different insights and that you could host. Is there a plenary or a panel coming up? All things to really showcase that they're a champion and that you respect and mutually support them. Different ways to think about how you can ladder up your call to action, depending on where your policymaker stands on this ladder of engagement. Right.
Melanie, we
Of
just
course,
have a
go ahead.
question about, can you say more about being bold versus keeping things attainable?
Yep. So I think when I say being bold, and we get this a lot too with using Spitfire's message tool, being bold in your vision. So thinking about ways to speak to what you envision for the world, and then having, or for the world in regards to the Farm Bill, and then having some key core attainable pieces to getting to that vision. So keeping it simple could be something like, we want an effective, transformative Farm Bill in 2023. And to do this, we want to increase X amount of funding for X program. That's a way to showcase how to be bold, pivot to a very specific program, but also keep it simple so it's not an entire messaging document full of talking points related to just one ask. That's helpful. Other ways that you can turn your messaging into bold statements is use of different communication channels. So considering social media, visuals, using your message box to create small videos, GIFs, things that you know are going to resonate, move people. Still using the messaging, the original messaging, of course. Other questions? Okay. A few final tips and best practices here when it comes to solidifying your call to action. Remembering what you want your audience to do. A strong call to action does not include raise awareness. This is a big problem that we've seen a lot in the nonprofit and foundation space. Of course, we want to raise awareness about our issue. We want to bring people into the fold, but a strong call to action for a policymaker or a target audience needs to be more specific. So lead with your values, but be solutions forward. What do they care most about? What do you want them to proceed with, and what solutions are actually attainable on the Farm Bill that they can sponsor or support? Know your audience, remember those 4 R's. What do they care about? How can you tap into that? And then don't forget to follow up. So this example here, this tweet thread, comes from Housing California, which is an organization that in 2020 led a digital plenary discussion with different government officials, federal policymakers, and they actually tweeted at Diane Yentl, who at that point was on the short list for the Department of Housing Secretary position, and they tweeted at her to thank her and also to remind her of what she spoke to as a panelist and the work that's still yet to come. These are all opportunities for you to follow up, even if it's a simple email to a staffer after a meeting, it's a tweet like this, an Instagram DM. There's plenty of different opportunities for you to engage and follow up on that call to action. Great. We have some time available for Q&A. If folks have questions related to messaging, communication strategies, engaging, identifying policymakers, I'd love to open it up if folks want to place questions in the chat or come off mute.
Thanks so much, Melanie. I'm wondering, Michelle, maybe if we want to end the recording now, that is sometimes better for us to